This is an RNZ podcast.
Media Watch's Colin Peacock, have you ever been to Albania?
No, I haven't, but I got two quick funny journalism stories about it if you were...
Oh, go on.
Okay, one was a guy I used to work with at BBC days, and in the 1980s when Albania was a complete hermit kingdom, completely under the reign of Enver Hoxha, there was an archaeological holiday, very niche sort of travel firm managed to get special permission for people to go and visit, for archaeologists and enthusiasts to go and visit special Roman sites there, and special visas. And so Alan, being very enterprising, thought, I'll get behind the curtain, I'll make a program, I'll do undercover stuff, managed to persuade these people that he deserved one of these tickets. Then got on this bus. It was a bus journey that went on a ferry and all the way to Albania. And as he got on, he said he looked around and like the entire bus was undercover British journalists, half of which he knew, and the other half were like clearly dressed down and all looking incredibly shifty and looking at each other. But the Albanian authorities weren't sort of worldly wise enough to realise it. And the second thing was in the 90s, I was doing a couple of programs with a guy, Jeremy Cook, a presenter, and he went off to cover as a correspondent. There was a kind of economic boom and then this massive bubble, and pyramid schemes all blew up and dragged the banks down and collapsed the entire economy. And there was real chaos. He went there to cover that, and everything got so bad that they were staying in a house their local fixers had set up for them, and power, water, everything got cut off. It was just that chaotic. And he had photographs of the fixers rigged up a kind of outdoor spit, so they roasted entire animals on the spit, which is what they ate, which was fine. And he said the problem was the lack of water, and the well ran out. And so he said in the end they were flushing the toilet with big 2-litre family bottles of Fanta.
A Fanta. Yuck.
Yeah.
Well, Albania is in a different state these days from the sounds of things, so there you go.
Yeah.
Colin Peacock is the presenter of Media Watch, and this is the Midweek Media Watch where Colin and I talk, well, media stuff for 25 minutes or so on a Wednesday. Let's do today's news first, shall we, Colin? Because we had, I was looking through the notes that you'd sent me about what we were going to talk about, and then just after 2 o'clock, an email landed in all of our inboxes here at RNZ about the resignation of Director of Content, is that the Chief Content Officer?
Chief Content Officer, yes.
Megan Whelan, who has worked at RNZ for a long time, best part of 20 years.
Yeah, that's right. She said in her statement that she turned up the day after the 7/7 bombing in London, which of course has been commemorated. So yeah, 20-year stretch, which is long. But I mean, last week you talked to Hayden on Midweek Media Watch about the other news just a week ago with Martin Gibson, even longer serving editor of Morning Report. Also retiring. So yeah, that's a lot of experience walking out the doors in the near future. This has been reported elsewhere too as a kind of news story, and for the New Zealand Herald, for example, they're saying, look, this comes at a time when RNZ is facing budget cuts. They've called for voluntary redundancy, which has also been in the news, and a time when the minister in particular is putting pressure on about falling radio ratings and all of that. So yeah, there's been, I guess there will be sort of speculation about what all this means. I mean, inevitably 2 senior people leave like that in the area of content. It's going to be a significant change, but it is, I suppose, one member of the executive out of 9 at RNZ. So in terms of, whether this foreshadows any kind of bigger shake-up, probably not. That feels a bit premature. But on the other hand, being that Chief Content Officer, it's a big job, and in terms of impact on what the public get, it's a bit different. With all due respect to the head of people or chief of strategy or of technology, it is about the content and what people get, the talent, the shows, the program, the output, and these days where you choose to distribute it, because in those 20 years that Megan's been here, I mean, was pretty much a radio network back then, with a bit of a website bolted on that was still new, and now very much a digital media operation. And her career here has spanned, exactly that time when things have really transitioned into a full multimedia organisation.
And she's sort of an unusual exec member of any exec, I suppose, in a sense, in that she worked her way up to that position and through. I mean, she's been at RNZ for 20 years. Started as an intern, worked in news on various programs in various roles, and ascended to that point, which is pretty unusual these days.
Well, yeah, it is. I mean, there are people in media organisations that have been there a long time. I've been around a while myself, but the comment that for public consumption from Chief Executive and Editor-in-Chief Paul Thompson was, Megan has done it all at RNZ. And, when I stopped to think about it, she really has, like presenting and, being a journalist through internship right at the start, working for RNZ Pacific. And there was one stage where we worked adjacently here at RNZ in Wellington when they founded The Wireless. Which didn't last.
The youth-focused website. This is in the early 2010s?
Yeah, that's right. And it was, it didn't last. The content kind of got folded into the rest of the digital operation. And, not everything works, but that's the thing about digital. You try new things, you do new things. She was a part of that. She's had a pretty varied career and involvement within RNZ. And as RNZ has become a multimedia organisation, it has engaged more with outside organisations like New Zealand On Air, creating video content, production companies, commissioning stuff, and that might seem very internal and a bit abstract to, people that just listen to the radio or absorb content from the website and other sources, but it really has been very different, and that's something she's absolutely been hands-on with at the time she's been in that content role.
Mm-hmm. All right. You also wanted to talk, Colin, about something that you see personally as a piece of extraordinarily unsatisfactory news reporting. You're starting with the big guns tonight. It's
sad to say, it's a piece of news that I heard. This actually came via the BBC, but it was on Morning Report this morning on the 8 a.m. news. In fact, it was on RNZ National yesterday. And we'll play the item in full as read by Nicola Wright in the bulletin. I think you'll probably see the problem straight away.
A lone peacock is laying siege to a village in Wiltshire in England. Locals in Marlborough told the BBC they aren't impressed with the arrival of Percy.
But he's a bit destructive, right, and very, very noisy.
My husband then went out and videoed it, walking along our ridge, squawking.
Seems to enjoy some mornings visiting my garden. Does like a breakfast off my runner beans.
He is a feisty young man.
He has destroyed a neighbour's garden.
Yeah.
Another village in Staffordshire, meanwhile, is battling up to 40 peacocks.
Up to 40 peacocks?
Battling them.
What was your problem with this, Colin? Is because it's about bad peacocks, is it?
Oh, well, no. I think you have to look... I see what you mean because of my name, that I've got some personal connection. No, I think if you look past that, wouldn't you concede that just the way that's framed is very unfair to that poor bird? For example, they give it a comedy name, Percy.
Percy's not a comedy name.
Oh, Percy Peacock?
It's alliterative, sure.
I think there's a bit of a dignity deficit in that. I think that's a persecution of Percy the Peacock. But you hear you hear those people there saying, and walking on our ridge, destroying our garden. He ate my beans. Who's to say these are, if you're a roaming peacock and you have the right to roam, I think, in the English countryside, they're saying it's their land, their stuff. Nicola Wright reading that little add-on at the end there, another village is battling 40 peacocks, which makes it sound like a horde, yet that item just singles out one, Percy. Mm-hmm. I think we hear, for example, we've heard so much today, you're on the story as well about resurrecting the moa with the help of Peter Jackson and some clever American scientists. So we're going to have stuff like this in the news about, it ate my cabbages, it ruined my garden. It's not the moa's fault. I just don't think it's quite fair.
To its credit, that we can't say that it excluded the voice of the peacocks. If anything, it included perhaps too much of the peacock.
Was that really the voice of Percy, or who they have decided to name Percy? I think that was a squawk of distress. I think the jackals of the electronic media are waving, and they've come for the one. Did they go for the 40 in Salisbury? They did not. They just went for the straggler, Percy.
Justice for peacocks. All right, we'll keep an eye on that, Colin. Let's talk about newspapers. Because that was about Marlborough in the UK, but there was some tough news from last week about more newspaper closures here, including our New Zealand's Marlborough.
That's right, yeah, the Marlborough Express, after 160-odd years, I think, about to go out of print in what I think is fair to say is the third big wave of closures from the big two publishers, that's Stuff and NZME, the publishers of the Herald. In 2018, Stuff did the biggest one. They closed or sold 26, possibly even more, community and a couple of farming papers all around the country. That was before Christmas. Then last year, NZME did the same, 14 community papers in the North Island. That was, pretty much all of their free weekly local ones, although some of those did get sold on or taken over by the journalists that work there and have survived in a different form. But now we have Stuff's decision last week, this came late last week, to stop printing most of their remaining community papers, as they say, to continue to grow digital news audiences around the country. And that includes the Marlborough Express, which has been 3 times a week, had been a daily paper all the way up to 2017, when itself and the Nelson Mail went to just 3 and 4 times a week respectively. And so that's going to happen in August. Marlborough Express will only be a kind of digital identity on the Stuff side.
And so how many other local papers are falling victim to this?
Yeah, so there were 6 remaining ones in Auckland. Some of them had already closed down in that previous wave. Then just rattling through the list, Cambridge Edition, Fielding, Rangatiki Herald, Franklin County News, and then in the Greater Wellington region, Hutt News, Kapimana News. Then top of the South Island, the Nelson and Tasman Leader. And then there's Northern Outlook, Southern Outlook. Those are, I think, Canterbury and North Otago Titles and the South Taranaki Star. But there were a couple of ones that will remain. The Wairarapa Midweek will still be published, which is because they also have the Wairarapa Times Age stuff.
Of course.
Reacquired that one, and that has a cover price and all that. So I guess they've got that territory sewn up. And Waikato Local, that's a weekly paper, that will still be produced. And Stuff was at pains to point out they will still publish a free weekly paper, The Weekender, in Marlborough. In
terms of reasons for this, I'm guessing it's cost cutting, Colin.
Yeah, pretty much. They say in their release that it's now 46%. Joe Norris, Stuff masthead boss, says the average community paper is now 46% more expensive to produce in 2022. And without the support of local councils and community businesses, they were unsustainable. So I guess they were saying they weren't getting the volume of ads they needed to keep it going. And that seems high, but, in just those 3 years for the cost to go up that much. But, we know, we looked at this issue before, newsprint production ending in New Zealand, the costs going absolutely through the roof. It was kind of double whammy during the COVID period. It simply did get much more expensive to produce a paper publication of just about any kind. And if it's easier for, I think, magazines that are only, periodical, but when you're trying to produce daily and weekly and run a press, publish operation, printing plant and on all of that, or contract one, those costs certainly mount up.
Job losses?
Well, they say less than 15, which, if that's true, shows you kind of how thin some of the papers were in actual journalism. And when you look through, I had a look back through some of the recent titles, and there's not a whole lot. There's a lot of sort of stuff, shared content, gardening pages and all of that. But having said that, even with a small number of journalists in a weekly publication, you can churn out significant local news. And of course there's the advertising as well, the notices, all that other stuff, which makes them a fixture for many people, particularly if they're home delivered. They will be reading them. And some businesses, it just is more effective as a local trade operation or something to advertise in a paper if everyone's getting it, than try and spend your money on Facebook and spray it around that way. So they'll be missed by those people as well.
The Trade Me Stuff deal was finalised last week, and this announcement came 48 hours later, there or thereabouts. Is it conspiratorial to suggest those might be related, Colin?
Well, I don't think so. For one thing, remember the Stuff company got carved in two, so it's the Trade Me deal is actually with the Stuff digital operation. I think you were talking about this with Hayden the other week when it all went through. They do the Stuff website, the Bulletin for 3 News and all of that. Stuffed mastheads is the other part of the operation, which is the newspapers and those ones like the Press and the Post and Waikato Times that have their own paywalls as well. But I wondered, though, at the time when that deal was announced, I thought, well, maybe, obviously Trade Me wants more amplification of their property
Listings,
stuff and listings and articles and all of that. So when Stuff said the first thing they're going to do is call the property section Trade Me Property rather than the title of Homed that they have now, that's their brand. So I wondered, maybe all these local papers could be beefed up and kept going by turning into a kind of local version of, property press. But clearly that's not what they're going to do.
Clearly not, no. Well, I mean, you have been looking out for puff pieces about Trade Me and Stuff's various publications, being as you are the media watcher. And I see the Cardrona Hotel. Admittedly, we talked to the owner of the Cardrona Hotel about selling it as well. So,
well, there you go.
But this has become Trade Me's most viewed property of the year.
Yes, and on Stuff's site saying so. And I when you see that, you think, oh, hello, because they did do. We did it on the Media Watch program, a piece that I think. Clearly was. I think it's not unfair to call it a puff piece about 20 years of Trade Me property. Hello.
Yeah, that was quite funny. Yeah. And so I like the observation. Nobody else touched this story.
That's right. Yeah, was the anniversary regarded as any? But in this case, it really was. So even the rival Herald, for example, made news out of the interest in the sale of Cardrona Hotel and the listing. They even referenced, Trade Me in the headlines, record-breaking Trade Me. So if even the rivals are putting, the name of your business partner in the headline and making a story out of it, I guess it passes the, the newsworthy test.
The newsworthy test, yeah. All right. Now, on Media Watch last weekend, you looked at the BBC apologising for broadcasting anti-Israel comments live from Glastonbury. It also copped flack for not broadcasting Kneecap. And this week, it copped some flack for something it didn't broadcast at all. Yeah,
in fact, another broadcaster did. It's an interesting story. So the BBC had commissioned from independent producers a documentary called Gaza, Doctors Under Attack, and you'll find it on YouTube if you are interested. It is quite something to see. Now, they delayed airing it. It was completed some time ago because they were reviewing another controversial documentary about Gaza called How to Survive a War Zone, and you might remember that one made news. It was pulled by the BBC effectively.
That's right.
It was discovered it has this teenager, 13-year-old boy, I think, who is effectively narrating a fair amount of it, and it turns out he was the son of a Hamas official. So, big problems about whether this was, made it, conflicted. And this latest one about doctors and hospitals, that includes, eyewitness accounts from frontline health workers in Gaza. And it eventually was picked up when it was clear the BBC weren't or couldn't use it, at least in its current form. It aired on Channel 4, which is also like a state-owned broadcaster like BBC, but it runs commercials and has a slightly different remit. And the guy who made this for the independent producer is a former news editor at Channel 4. And he's now gone public accusing the BBC of trying to stop him talking about, the difficulty they had after making the film, getting it screened. He claims there was gagging, BBC disputes it. But, interestingly, they say at Channel 4, look, we fact-checked this. It complies with the broadcasting codes of the regulator, editorial standards. So we are fine with it. And I had a look through it, and at the end, I don't know if this is relevant to that, but it has statements from the IDF, refuting some of the claims in it, and also even from Hamas as well, and some independent sort of doctors groups as well. So they've at least made an effort to put some sort of contextualising comment at the end.
Hey, just before we get to the response, so the BBC commissioned this documentary from an independent production, but then delayed airing it and then pulled the program. Is it unusual then that the producer would be able to take that documentary and shop it around even after the BBC commissioned it in the first place? I found that quite curious.
Yeah, I don't know what the arrangement was because, I think they lost confidence in it because at some point they said, look, we can actually make use of this in a news form. We can find a way to screen it, maybe as sort of packages in a news program with a discussion or something like that.
Right.
So and then clearly I think, no, hang on, we've made a film here. And, so then it becomes contractual and all sorts of disputes. But the BBC wanted to do something with it, but not what they had effectively agreed to make, and that's where it all broke down, and Channel 4 stepped in.
All right, so Channel 4 screened it. What was the critical response like?
Well, it was pretty good. No one said it was unfair or unreasonable. In fact, The Guardian had an interesting comment saying that the biggest and possibly only failure of that program is the circumstances of its broadcast threatened to overshadow the content, which is a sort of interesting comment. And the FT, Financial Times, reviewed it and said, look, it was interesting what they said, because they referenced some of the comments by the British reporter and narrator of it, who were saying, from the first day of the war, the Palestinians, what they needed most was attacked, its healthcare system. And, they're saying, look, with a comment like that, you can feel almost immediately that, this isn't something the BBC would have been comfortable with, such a bold statement like that. So the FT critic says it isn't ponderous and caveated in the way that once we might have expected had it aired as once intended on Panorama, which is BBC documentary strand. It said that the reviewer's comment is interesting. It says, this illustrates why the BBC needs to find a way to tell such compelling stories.
That's interesting. I mean, the BBC, it was hugely controversial, wasn't it? The BBC was attacked by many of its own staff about this decision.
Yeah, and that's happened before, like with that previous film, How to Survive a War Zone. So more than 300 figures and I think another 100 journalists from the organisation, as you say, said, look, we're concerned the BBC is being, in the words of the letter, crippled by the fear of being perceived as critical of the Israeli government. And they also have focused very much on a controversial figure, a guy called Robbie Gibb, who's on the BBC board, was appointed by the previous government and the BBC's Editorial Standards Committee. He worked as a spin doctor for Theresa May when she was Prime Minister, for the Conservative Party when they were in power, and he led a consortium that bought the Jewish Chronicle newspaper and website. Between 2020 and 2024, he was the director of Jewish Chronicle Media. But the BBC says, look, he has no role, and the board doesn't in the editorial decisions over films like this.
Any response from the BBC about all of this rhetoric flying around? Yeah,
well, they say, look, we still have robust discussions. The journalism is a central part of our process. Reinforce that thing about Robbie Gibb not having a part in it. But they also say, look, we remain committed to covering this conflict impartially, and they're pointing to other things they have produced. They say award-winning documentaries such as Life and Death in Gaza, which I think has been out in cinemas as well, and one that I'm not familiar with, Gaza 101. So they say, look, we haven't shied away from it, but certainly they've got themselves in a hole commissioning here two films that one British broadcaster has seen fit to broadcast without apparent controversy, and the BBC, which asked to have it made, hasn't.
A similar theme over the next story that you wanted to talk about, this sort of fear of criticism about this. And you looked at this on Media Watch last weekend as well. Journalist Antoinette Lattouf, wrongly fired by the ABC. She has now spoken herself.
Yeah, so we looked at that at some length on Media Watch on the weekend. She's now spoken. She only spoke outside of court because the BBC was said to have wrongly fired her.
ABC.
ABC, beg your pardon. She had made comments about Israel's military campaign in Gaza. She is of Lebanese origin herself. She did a 5-day fill-in stint before Christmas on ABC, and as soon as she took to the air, there were complaints about her, allegations of bias and so on. So, and the ABC kind of, in the words of the judge, panicked and fired her before the stint was even over. So she only spoke briefly outside the courtroom, but now she's gone on a new podcast, which is now a co-host of, called We Used to Be Journos. Interesting title. And this is what she said about what it felt like when she was, on the air, and then she realised that she was becoming the subject of complaints.
By the conclusion of my workday, I had received a phone call from Elizabeth Green to give me a heads up that there was a barrage of complaints and that I was being watched. I mean, that is just to try and perform and do live radio for 3.5 hours knowing you're being surveilled. Like, we can't be trusted near a microphone. They keep throwing words around like objectivity, like we don't know what to do with facts, despite our track record, despite my impeccable track record, that I don't, that I'm just going to be some loose cannon.
Whatever we had imagined about her was just going to end up on local radio in between the Michael Bublé and the Christmas stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, that reference to that was because she described it as a light and fluffy pre-Christmas program. It was never going to get into, or unlikely to get into, issues of geopolitics. So the kind of panic about what she might say was all being driven by complaints about her because of her previous statements on social media.
She'd be feeling vindicated by this court ruling then.
Well, partly, yeah, because the judgment didn't agree that race was a factor, which was something they cited, but it did say wrongly fired just for holding a political opinion. And The other interesting part of it, though, is that the judge did say it was unhelpful and inconsiderate to the ABC for her to post stuff about Gaza and Israel, and particularly one Human Rights Watch post that was at the centre of the court case. So it kind of still leaves open this question about what's private comment and what's, what are your duties in terms of public and corporate responsibility. But she made a good point about that, about a possible double standard. It's a weird story that came out just a month ago. So the ABC's relatively recently appointed chair was kind of caught out and exposed on the ABC's Media Watch that an old mate of his, a comedian called Ostentatious, who goes all the way back to the 80s, who is Jewish, was complaining to him that he'd been excluded from broadcasts on ABC Radio. And Antoinette Lattouf said, look, why does his complaint get action from the board, whereas I got, kind of singled out? This is what she had to say.
There was a complaint from a has-been comedian who said, I'm not getting enough airplay. I'm not getting enough attention for my tiny little shows. And that's because, and then weaponized anti-Semitism. And then Kim Williams was found to have intervened. So I'm like, based on his conduct and his animosity towards me, the National Press Club, based on his actions with this comedian, I don't buy that apology.
Right.
And I haven't been apologised to directly. And I think Kim Williams, there still needs to be accountability. And I think Kim Williams needs to be held accountable.
Yeah, it's a very, very strange story because, suddenly after the Kim Williams sort of reached out to these local radio producers, they all suddenly had this guy on for his kind of pub tour of a guy who, doesn't usually pull that much of a crowd these days. So very weird.
Colin, with 1 minute left, one of the questions that keeps me up at night is, of course, who watches the Media Watchers? And well, I have an answer to that. It's Andrew who sent me an email regarding the comments about the peacock story. I recently watched a program that went into detail about how a town in the US had huge problems with wild peacocks wreaking havoc. The community was split, some wanting to protect them, others wanting them curtailed, even sterilised. Someone else has texted in to say, peacocks are not native in Britain. They should not be left to terrorise the humans. So there you go, Colin.
Okay. Wild peacocks wreak havoc. That sounds like a kind of cable TV thing you'd see on, one of those channels far down the slate.
At number one on Netflix, actually, in this day and age, probably, wouldn't it be?
Yeah.
All right.
Wild peacocks wreak havoc.
Colin,
tonight on Cops. Yeah, it's a bit like that.
Thank you, Colin. Nice talking to you.
If no one else commissions it, I will.
Oh, dearie me. Colin Peacock.